Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
We're thrilled to welcome Cecilia Malmström to the Eurofile. Cecilia is a former member of the European Commission and the European Parliament, serving as European Commissioner for Trade from 2014 to 2019, and as European Commissioner for Home Affairs from 2010 to 2014. As European Commissioner for Trade, she represented the EU in the World Trade Organization and other international trade bodies. She was responsible for negotiating bilateral trade agreements with key countries, including agreements with Canada, Japan, Mexico, Singapore, Vietnam, and the 4 founding Mercosur countries. Cecilia joined the Peterson Institute for International Economics as non-resident fellow in 2021, where she hosts the Trade Winds biweekly virtual event series. She's also a visiting professor at the School of Business, Economics, and Law at the University of Gothenburg. Cecilia, welcome to the Eurofile.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Cecilia, thanks so much for being here. You were the trade commissioner during Trump's first term. We have this little thing called an election happening soon. And should Trump win, one of the major topics has been Trump sort of really pushing that he's going to invoke tariffs, not just on countries like China, but on allies and partners such as the European Union. You were there in 2017. There were Trump tariffs that were done against the EU. Maybe you could walk us through how the EU responded and then how you think the European Union might respond should Trump win to tariffs this time.
Well, thank you, Max. Yes, I had the honor of serving as trade commissioner both under the last year of the Obama administration, where we negotiated the TTIP agreement, which was supposed to be a trade agreement between the EU and the US, with USTR Mike Froman at that time. And then there was the election, and then the USTR became Robert Lighthizer, who I hear might be coming back. And of course, TTIP was put in the freezer even before the elections. We didn't know how the outcome would be. We thought if Hillary would win, maybe we could take it out and see what could be done. But we had difficulties. Then there was this constant threat of tariffs from day one, I would say, both on steel and aluminium, but then also on cars and on French wine. And there were a lot of discussions. Of course, we had to engage to try to see how we could avoid them. And then there was this investigation, the 201 investigation, I think it was called, that then resulted in, for national security reasons, tariffs on steel and aluminium.
Against our NATO allies and partners.
Yes, and that was the first shock. I mean, most European countries are NATO members. So is mine, Sweden now. I'm happy for that. And consider themselves as allies. And I had colleagues who had fathers who had fought together with American soldiers on the beaches of Normandy. And to be labeled as a national security threat to the US, that was such an immense insult. How can we be a threat to national security? But anyway, well, we tried to talk and see what could be done, but eventually they were imposed. So then we took it to the WTO because we thought that this was pure protectionism. It was not a national security threat. And together with 11 other countries, including China, actually. Now, WTO has not been, even at that time, was not very functional, but it was the right thing to do. And then after a while, we retaliated. We calculated how much loss would this be for us, what would be the equivalence, and then we imposed countermeasures. I don't remember the exact sum on, everything from orange juice from Florida, Harley Davidson, whiskey, and a few other items as well.
Yeah, I recently heard Mitch McConnell, senator from Kentucky, sort of saying tariffs don't work and highlighting the impacts that it had on the bourbon industry in Kentucky. And so I guess when looking ahead, I would imagine the EU is thinking in the same way. When I think back, I think of when Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission who preceded Ursula von der Leyen, came to the White House for kind of a showdown meeting with Trump over tariffs. And that seemed to kind of create a degree of détente, that the EU seemed to be quite tough in its response. So do you think there will be a tough EU response should tariffs suddenly be put in place against European products?
Well, I had the privilege of being in the room where it happened with Jean-Claude. And I think Jean-Claude, he's a very clever person. He had discovered that Trump wants to make a deal. So he was there to try to make a deal, a sort of mini trade agreement that would at least allow President Trump to declare some sort of victory, where we said we would buy much more LNG gas from you. This was before the Russian invasion. And we would buy much more soya beans, because these two things somehow were very symbolic and important for Trump and for some of his advisors who were in that room as well. And then we agreed on something on WTO and on trying to maintain good relations. So that was a moment with a little bit of detente. And Mr. President Trump at that time, he was not aggressive. He was trying to see if a deal could be made. But we did have those retaliatory tariffs. They were there. And we hoped very much that President Biden would take them away. But he didn't. But they were transformed to quotas instead, while we would be negotiating some kind of deal on sustainable steel, which we all thought would be very quick and easy. But it isn't, because they're still there. And those quotas are still banning European companies from the market. We have lost a lot of market shares. I think there are 1,426 different categories of quotas, and they are illegal. WTO later declared these as illegal. So there was a disappointment that the Biden administration have not taken them away.
So that's a great segue into talking a little bit about the current EU-US economic and trade relationship. As you mentioned, there was a lot of hope coming into the Biden administration that things would get better quickly and significantly. But some of these tariffs have not been removed. And obviously, a lot of the focus of the alliance has been on the defense side. How would you characterize the relationship on the trade side for the last 3.5, 4 years under this Biden administration? And what's the view of the Biden administration's trade policy from the EU?
Well, just to say on Ukraine, excellent cooperation. This is actually the most important question in Europe right now. We are concerned about tariffs and about economic policies, but Ukraine is an existential threat. And if we lose America's support on this, it's going to be ugly and dangerous, and a lot of people are going to die. All the other things can be sort of handled. But this is really what is worrying Kiev, but also Europe, that there will be no American support to Ukraine. Well, I think relations improved a lot. But having said that, the European Union, or in Europe as a whole, and the US, we are friends and neighbors and allies. There's a lot of historical gratitude for the assistance in the Second World War. Our trade relationship is the most important in the world. We trade for billions every week of goods and services. We share lots of values and a lot of history together. We were working very closely in the post-World War institution building in Bretton Woods under American leadership, but Europe supported that. And that has served the world rather well, these institutions. We are talking now it's a macro week, so everybody's talking about IMF and World Bank and how to celebrate. But WTO or GATT was also created a little bit later, but in the same spirit. So I think relationships had improved, and they've been very good on a personal level. The Commission President Ursula von der Leyen gets along very well with President Biden. I think they have developed a sort of personal friendship that is important. And she has been the person to call in Europe, to quote the famous Kissinger question, who shall I call in Europe? But of course, on trade, there hasn't been much done. We were disappointed that the tariffs were transformed into quotas and that it turned out to be so difficult to find an agreement. There was the creation of Trade and Tech Council, which was not a trade agreement. It was at least a platform where you could meet and discuss trade-related issues in a broad sense. I think that has been a good forum for high-level officials to meet, and also civil servants in different areas, but it has under-delivered. It's very much a talking shop. Talking shops can be good when there's nothing else there, because you build relations and you identify possible future areas of cooperation, but it has under-delivered. And the Biden administration has made very clear that free trade agreements is nothing for them, and they're not interested. But we could have done a little bit more on standards, on definitions on green technology, on facilitating in digital, and so on. So if Kamala Harris wins, maybe you could see, can you scale up the TTC, the Trade and Tech Council? It's unclear what happens if Trump wins. But then, of course, people in the Commission, I have left the Commission 5 years ago, but they are, of course, planning for different scenarios. And should there be massive tariffs of 10 or 20%, as Trump have threatened to do? I mean, he did it last time, so he will probably try to do it this time as well. There will be different scenarios. I would imagine that Europe will try to retaliate if that happens in a measured, targeted, WTO-compatible way if it happens. And I hope that they will make that very clear in the month to come before the formal presidential installation day.
You mentioned TTIP before. You were working on that during the Obama administration. If, let's just say, there was an American administration open to trying to sort of have some sort of big trade agreement between the U.S. and EU, do you think TTIP is worth reviving? Or is there something there to sort of dust off the shelf? Or are we in kind of a new world where perhaps we've sort of moved on from the kind of classic trade agreements, and maybe there isn't that much incentive for either side to really negotiate a common free trade agreement between the U.S. and EU? What are your thoughts on the kind of the future of TTIP as an enterprise?
Well, I still think it's odd that the EU and the US are its biggest trading partners, and we don't have a trade agreement. Still, we trade a lot. And there are tariffs there. They're not significant, but in some areas they are there. But most of all, when it comes to standards and NTBs and so on, there are things that could be done. So I still think that one day we could have a trade agreement. But I don't believe in taking TTIP out from the freezer, defrosting it and see, okay, what can we do? We probably have a new mandate and sit together, because there was a lot of emotions around this in Europe as well. So we would have to call it something else. And we would probably need a new mandate and see maybe it should be a little bit limited, because we did a lot of progress. But there are difficulties in the agriculture area, obviously.
The chlorinated chickens.
Yes.
Or European protection of its agricultural market.
We are both protecting our agriculture in different ways, and we are both superpowers in that regard. It was hard to find agreement. But then also how you deal with standards and how you have mutual recognition and so on. It's hard because in the US you have like 1 million agencies who do the standards, and then they interact in different ways. In the European Union we have the Commission. The Commission sets the standards. So if something is wrong, or if you have a complaint, or if there's an abuse, you turn to the Commission. So we were trying to see, can we find a way, this very centralized way in Europe and the decentralized way in the US can coexist? And we had lots of interesting discussion, but we never solved that. Even if Harris wins, I think for the first 2 years, nothing will happen on this. We will have to see what's on the table. How can we cooperate on a more low-key basis? If we talk about trade and economic cooperation, what can we do between us to strengthen the Trade and Tech Council, to maybe expand its mandate, to look at maybe in this specific area, we can agree on standards and on definitions and on facilitation. What can we do when it comes to green cooperation? What can we do on China? Because we share a concern about China. I think on export controls, there could be a lot done. We have a investment screening mechanism right now that was inspired from the CFIUS, not the same way because the Commission doesn't have judicial power to scrutinize this, so it's more of a coordination. This is one of the areas where we worked very well with the Trump administration to get advice from how CFIUS worked and so on. For us, it was vis-a-vis Russia, but also vis-a-vis China, of course.
Maybe one more question on this. Do you think that in some ways it's easier to work on future or new technologies, new things that are emerging, where then if there's good US-EU cooperation, setting the standards in coordination as opposed to the EU comes up with a standard, the US comes up with a standard, and then we meet and say, you change, and then you say, no, you change. Then it's harder to cooperate. It's sort of easier to do it as you're developing.
Absolutely. In nanotechnology, in some of the life science technologies where we don't really have standards, or in AI, this is one of the things that the Trade and Tech Council delivered. There were some ethical principles and so on AI. So I think that's easier. But you could also take old definitions and maybe don't require that you adopt to us or the other way around, but we have this mutual recognition, which we have memorandums of understanding in the pharma sector, for instance. So that could expand. We said that you test it this way, we test it this way to make sure it's safe for citizens, because that's mainly what it's about, right? And we recognize the way you do it.
You mentioned it's likely even under a Harris administration for a couple of years, not much is going to happen. And we've talked about the changes around trade on the US side. There's also been a lot of change on the EU side around trade. Some of the trade agreements with Australia, with Mercosur, are just stuck. It's been hard over the last few years. The new Commission's political guidelines talk about the primacy of economic security. And understandably, that's just an overarching concern for a lot of leaders there. I think it's also probably an easier point to make politically, let's be perfectly honest, than free trade agreements. These days, how do you view the evolution of the EU's trade agenda? Also understanding different member states view this very differently. Sweden obviously is on probably not exactly the same side as a country like France when it comes to the trade agenda. There are significant differences that might make that agenda difficult or change it significantly over the next Commission. How do you view that?
Well, it has definitely changed the last 5 years or the last decade, because when I was trade commissioner, when President Trump started to say that trade wars are good and they're easy to win, and starting to make trade more of an issue of national security and a militarization of trade vis-a-vis Mexico, vis-a-vis Europe and others, in a way that brought Europe and other allies together. We said, no, trade wars are not good. So we actually managed to finalize trade agreements that had been negotiated for quite a long time with Japan, with Singapore, with Canada and others, to show that we want to stick together, because this world is becoming a bit, difficult. Now, so much have changed. I mean, the geopoliticization of trade is obviously there. We have the greening of trade. We have have geopolitics, we have companies trying to diversify and to either de-risk or decouple. So it's different today. I hope that the incoming commission, we are in a sort of waiting stage now for the new commission to come and for the hearings to begin in a couple of weeks. If it's not going to happen before, there's a G20 trade meeting taking place in Brazil today. So of course the Mercosur agreement will be discussed. There is a huge majority of member states want to sign the Mercosur agreement. France is one of the key opponents of this. There are attempts to see, can we set up some sort of fund for farmers in case they feel that they are losing out. It's a very limited quota on agriculture. But the Mercosur countries are important allies as well. But now as Commission, we finalized it. And then for different political reasons, it's been hanging around there for 5 years. And during that time, Mercosur countries, especially Brazil and Argentina, whose main trading partner was Europe, today it's China. So we have lost geopolitically in a way that we are paying for now. So hopefully Mercosur will be agreed. With Mexico, it's also pending. That has been because of the elections also in Mexico. There are some issues on energy that they tried to do. We did finalize with Chile and New Zealand. They entered during this mandate. Australia was stuck on agriculture, as always. I think that can be solved. I mean, you just have to say, okay, let's resume where we were, because it was almost done. It was basically ready to be signed, and there was some disagreement at the last moment. So I think the EU will try to do that. I would hope also that the European Commission would try to reach out to the Indo-Pacific. It would be great if Europe joined the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, where US is not in, even if it was a US idea. The UK just joined, so it could be a forum where the EU and UK could help the other allies to set standards, because there's a lot happening in the CPTPP, and all our friends and allies are there. But to come back to what you said also, if you read the mission statements for the next Commissioner of Trade, which will probably, if he passes the hearing, Marko Sefcovic, who's been in the Commission for a long time. He's a very nice, hardworking, intelligent person. He'll do great. It says that you are Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security. So that is, of course, something that is looming all over. We learned the lesson the very hard way, many countries in the European Union, when Germany and others realized how dependent they were on Russian oil and gas. And then, Russia instrumentalized that in a very complicated way. And now we are also waking up to the same that you hear in America, that we are very dependent on China when it comes to raw materials and metals that we need for the green transition, that we need in weapons, that we need in the digital economy, and so on. China dominates that market totally. So we need to find a way to diversify that need. And this is an area where I think independently who sits in the White House, Europe and US can work together.
Let me ask you a follow-up about the CPTPP. I was in the Obama State Department, and at the very end, Obama's pivot to Asia sort of crashed and burned. Burned is probably overstating it, but it crashed with the Trans-Pacific Partnership being an American idea. It was negotiated and then essentially died in the Republican control.
And now China has applied to join.
And so I think your call, which we first met earlier this year in Madrid, and you gave, I think, an outstanding speech outlining this proposal as well for the EU to seek to join CPTPP.
This is it's not a commission official.
Yes, but any of the Asia hands in Washington listening to this, well, their ears will perk up and say, oh my God, that would be amazing, because CPTPP, I think the sense is it lacks this sort of big anchor market. That's what China is seeking to do. But if the EU came in, it would act as this anchor market. What is sort of holding Europe back from doing that? I mean, my sense is it's hard for the EU to enter into something that's already baked. And the EU being so big wants to sort of drive it. And so is that a huge obstacle, or what is holding the EU back?
I think you're spot on. Geopolitically, it makes every sense of the world. It would be the right thing to do. But I think that's an item that the EU usually is a big economic power. And when we negotiate, usually it's with smaller markets. And to enter something that is already basically negotiated, it's something that we haven't done. So I think that's part of it. And also there are concerns that if we also enter there with a couple of others lining up, I mean, there are maybe South Korea, they are contemplating joining, and Costa Rica has applied, Uruguay and a few others, and China, of course, and Taiwan. What's going to happen to WTO? Is this going to be a mini WTO that really kills the organization? So I think some is more ideological resistance that if we do that, WTO is dead. I don't think that's necessarily true. As long as it operates within the WTO rules that are there today, it could actually be a way to revitalize some areas and show that, okay, this is a plurilateral agreement that others could join in specific segments. Lots of things happening in the digital economy or in the green goods economy. So I don't think that's true, but I think that's also plays in.
Well, that was going to be my next question is, as you keep talking about the countries who want to join, I kept thinking, well, this is becoming close to a global mix of countries. So what is the prospect? Recognizing this is a very broad question, but all the conversations we're having about trade and different geopolitical dynamics that are getting built into all of this, what is the prospect for the WTO, for the Bretton Woods system over the next few years when all of these regional agreements are starting to pop up and potentially different standards emerge in different parts of the world?
Well, it is a contradiction, of course, but it has been very difficult to make agreements within the WTO. The EU has been one of its fiercest defender and is working together with, there's something called the Ottawa Group that was founded by the Canadians, and it's a group of sort of middle ground countries who really believes in the WTO, from north and south and from all over the place, big and small. And we have been trying to put forward proposals and working to reform, and that must continue. There is a little bit of a momentum right now in the WTO when it comes to some smaller agreement, which is good, but it lacks sort of the oomph to really do big things. Because if the US and China are not respecting WTO rules, which they're not, then why should others? And then we have seen, especially when it comes to minerals and metals, there is a boom in export restrictions that are WTO non-compliant. And with industrial policies and subsidies, it is also threatening. So the ideal place to try to solve this would, of course, be WTO, together with World Bank, IMF, OECD, to sit together. Okay, what is a good subsidy? Because subsidies can be good when the market cannot deliver in the green transition, for instance. And what is a bad subsidy that actually hurts my neighbors as well? There is a framework for this in the WTO. This has been discussed for decades, but that framework needs to be updated. So ideally, this is what we could do. G20 has been calling for it, and this week in Washington, they also try to see if we can do something. So subsidies and also the carbon pricing. EU has this CBAM that is entering into force gradually, but there are like 40, 50 different jurisdictions on carbon pricing because everybody realized that pricing carbon is a clever thing. And you can do it in different ways. But the risk today is, of course, that you don't do it the same ways that I do it, so I will punish you. And then we increase the trade tension. While we should sit and, okay, if we want to achieve the same thing, let's cooperate. Let's try to find a way to combine, have a mutual recognition of these different methods because we want to achieve the same thing. And then WTO, together with our institution, would be the ideal place to do that. And I think that struggle must continue. But if some countries want to go even further and set some rules like the CPTPP, or there's a group of countries who have also joined DEPA, which is a digital partnership, only 5 or 6 countries, but others are looking at it. That might be a way to revitalize a WTO. Because the biggest problem with WTO, some would say the biggest assets, is that 164 countries need to agree. And it's been really hard to get countries like India to agree.
Maybe we could close by talking about the big issue that has roiled European politics recently, and that is the EU invoking tariffs on Chinese EVs. Germany voted no on these tariffs in kind of incredibly sort of unusual situation where we're overruled by other countries within the EU, and so the tariffs are going to be put in place. What is your view on these tariffs from a kind of a Washington perspective? In some ways, we looked at them as not quite being high enough to actually fully protect the European car market. But I'm curious for your take on how you saw this playing out and how do you think this will evolve?
Well, thank you for that question. It is indeed something that has dominated the debate in many countries, and I think it's not over yet. First of all, I think it's clear that China is not respecting the rules. The Chinese government is subsidizing car companies, hundreds of them, and other companies in a way that is not allowed. So they're not playing by the book, and that is something that needs to be stated. And then, of course, in the green transition, Europe has a lot of old and big and economically very important car businesses, but they have, to be honest, not really been able to cope with the transition. So they have not been able to deliver affordable, high-quality electric vehicles to European consumers. China has. So in a way, you could say that China is actually subsidizing the green transition in Europe. But of course, this affects jobs, and it leads to a lot of concerns for European car makers and their employees. And in some countries, this is such an important part of the economy. So that is why the Commission started this investigation. I mean, you can read it. It's online. It's 700 pages. It's super boring, but it's public. So it's been done in the proper way, and it shows that yes, some of these companies are illegally subsidized, and that's why it has been retaliated. And there's a difference depending on how much the companies have cooperated. So the difference between 8% up to 37, I think, or 36. But the aim is not, like in the US, to shut Chinese cars totally from the European market. The aim is to slow down the penetration of the market, to give European companies some time to catch up. Is this the right tool? Well, a majority thought so, or at least a majority was not against. I'm not sure personally that this is the most clever move, because it won't really solve the problem. The problem is more the lack of innovation in Europe, and we will see retaliation. And we don't really need scaling up trade war right now. The Chinese have said that they will retaliate on dairy products, on French cognac and pork to start with. And the European Commission is already investigating other products on batteries and on some nanotechnology. And potentially this could be scaled up. But now they're here. A majority have decided they will be there for 5 years, but they could be abolished if there is a political agreement. And the Commission is talking to the Chinese authorities to see if there's anything to be done. There has been talks about, minimum prices, limitations on quotas, which is not really WTO compliant. Managed trade, usually we don't like that. So we'll see what happens. But I have the feeling that we don't really know with the next Commission, but really scaling up the trade war with China is not in Europe's interest.
Maybe last question. I think there's been a view here in Washington that the top of the agenda for the Europe-China conversation should really be Chinese support for the Russian defense industry. And Europe has expressed its sort of diplomatic displeasure at what China is doing to support Russia's defense industry and Russia's war effort. But there hasn't quite been an articulation of consequences should China continue. And that we look at China's economy right now and think it's pretty vulnerable. China wants access to the European market. Are there levers that Europe could play here vis-a-vis Chinese support for Russia, or is the EV conversation really have to be front and center first to avoid an escalating trade war? How would that topic sit in how Europe engages China?
Well, hopefully a new commission will be in place beginning of December, that this will be one of their prime tasks to have a China strategy. We have one, but it needs updating. But it's hard. We are 27 countries and, some are more pro-China than others. But the main problem for at least 26 of us is that China is supporting the Russian economy and the Russian war machine and to kill Ukrainians, to keep the war going. And that is a problem. The only leverage we would have as Europeans is our biggest jewel, our internal market. So somehow making clear to the Chinese that we will limit access to the internal market unless you stop this. I would hope that would be something. And I know lots of people are talking about this. There's probably lots of intelligent people sitting writing memos about this for the new commission. But we don't have any military weight. This is probably the asset that we do have. It's a tricky balance with China because yes, they are subsidizing illegally. Yes, what they're doing to Hong Kong and Taiwan is terrible. They are violating every human rights you can violate, basically. But still, we need them for the green transition, and we are trade partners. That's why the Commission talks about de-risking from China, not decoupling. De-risking in minerals and others, but for 85% of the trade is rather unproblematic. But on Ukraine, especially if the US withdraws its support from Ukraine, I think we need to step up in all areas when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And this is obviously one. China's support and also India's support to the Russian economy, because that is prolonging the war.
Cecilia Malmström, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the Eurofile. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Eurofile. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. For more expert analysis on other foreign policy topics, visit csis.org/podcasts.